Eleanor carefully ran her fingers over the yellowed edges of old photographs, feeling the roughness of the paper with her fingertips, as if every scratch on it contained a piece of the past that was escaping from memory, but not from her heart. Her gaze lingered on one picture, her father, strict, trim, in a perfectly fitting suit, holding her hand, and she, still quite a girl, in a light dress with lace sleeves, laughing, looking directly into the lens. She didn't know then how much she would miss him years later, how she would find herself hearing his voice in her head, getting fainter and fainter, and her memories becoming more and more blurred, like a landscape behind fogged glass on a rainy day. Before we continue, I am very curious. Which country are you from, dear listeners? Write in the comments where you are listening to us from. Enjoy listening. She sighed heavily, ran her hand over her face, wiping away a tear that had come from nowhere, and closed the album, carefully placing it on the coffee table next to a cup of unfinished tea that had already cooled, leaving a thin amber border on the edges of the white porcelain. The image of the invitation came back to her over and over again. White paper, golden letters, solemn wording, as if from another world, the world she had once been in, but had long since lost the key to it. Victoria has always been the star of the family, bright, confident, surrounded by attention and love, while Eleanor, despite her outward resemblance to her sister, remained in the shadows, habitually content with the role of an inconspicuous spectator, someone who is not remembered first, but who is remembered when necessary. Her mother, Martha, never hid her admiration for Victoria, nor did she hide her disappointment in Eleanor, especially after she, contrary to the expectations of her family, chose a simple life unrelated to bright business prospects, abandoning family ambitions for a modest but honest existence, where the most important thing was not success, not status, and love and care for my son. "Mom, you really don't want to go?" Noah's voice brought her out of her thoughts, and she looked up at him. The boy was standing in the doorway, barefoot, in warm pajamas, disheveled after turning around in bed before going to bed. There was genuine curiosity mixed with mild concern in his eyes, because he had already learned to notice when his mother was sad, even if she was trying to hide it. Eleanor smiled, motioning for him to come closer, and when he climbed onto her lap, she hugged him tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of baby shampoo and warm milk. "I'm just not sure if we'll be welcome," she finally said, trying to choose her words so that her son wouldn't feel her doubts as keenly as she felt them herself. "But this is a family," Noah said, looking at her with wide eyes. "They love us, don't they?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She wanted to tell him the truth, but at the same time she didn't want to destroy his childish faith in goodness, didn't want to explain that sometimes relatives can be colder than strangers, that love can be conditional, and family ties are just a formality that is maintained for the sake of decency. "Of course they do," she said softly, stroking his head. "It just happens that people don't see each other for a long time and get a little distant from each other." Noah nodded, apparently accepting this answer, but his thoughtful look suggested that he was still thinking about what he had heard. "But you're going anyway, aren't you?" "What is it?" he finally asked, looking into her eyes. She couldn't refuse him. Not now, when I saw how much he wanted it. "Yes," she said, though her heart sank in apprehension. "We'll go." The next few days flew by quickly, filled with work, worries, and rare moments of relaxation, during which Eleanor tried not to think about the upcoming meeting with her family. But the closer the wedding date approached, the more she felt anxiety inside, dull and persistent, like an oncoming wave that could not be stopped. On the evening before the celebration, she was sorting through things in the closet, trying to find something suitable, something that would not look too simple, but also did not seem deliberately pretentious. At the back of the closet, she came across a dress she hadn't worn in a long time, dark blue, with an elegant cut that accentuated her waist, with long sleeves and a neckline that revealed her collarbones. It was both strict and feminine, and looking at it, Eleanor suddenly remembered that her father had once approved of it, saying that this color especially suited her. She ran her hand over the soft fabric and, sighing, decided that this would be the right choice. Noah was sitting on the bed at the time and looking at his suit with delight, dark blue, almost matching his mother's outfits, with a neatly pressed white shirt and a small tie, which he stubbornly tried to tie himself, despite all the failures. "Mom, will there be a cake at the wedding?" "What is it?" he asked hopefully. Eleanor laughed. "Of course it will be. How about without a cake?" "Then everything will be fine," he stated with confidence, jumping off the bed. Eleanor would like to share his confidence, but something inside told her that this evening would bring not only the sweetness of the wedding cake, but also the bitter aftertaste of the past that she had tried so hard to leave behind. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten as Victoria, holding the microphone, walked straight towards them, and the hall plunged into tense silence, interrupted only by the muffled whispers of the guests, clearly intrigued by what was happening. The spotlight, thrown directly on their table, made her freeze, and Noah, who was sitting next to her, tensed slightly, instinctively squeezing her mother's hand in his small one. "Dear guests," Victoria began with a deliberately warm intonation, rolling the words on her tongue as if she had carefully chosen them before pronouncing them. "On this special day, I want to share with you a moment that is really important to me. After all, as you know, family is not only a joy, but also a responsibility. And today, I want to introduce you to a man who, despite all the circumstances, remains a part of our family." Eleanor felt her fingers go cold. What's it? Humiliation under the spotlight? A revealing confession? Victoria never did anything for no reason. There was always a hidden subtext in her words, and carefully thought-out intentions were hidden behind a friendly smile. "My dear sister Eleanor," Victoria continued, turning slightly towards them and extending her hand in their direction, "and her charming son, my nephew Noah." Several people at the table started clapping politely but with restraint, as if they didn't fully understand what was expected of them. One of the guests leaned over to his neighbor and whispered something softly. Tension hung in the air. Eleanor felt a rush of heat to her cheeks and forced herself to get up from her chair, straightening her back and squeezing her son's hand a little tighter. She didn't like this attention, this unnatural, pretentious scene that Victoria had made. But it would be weakness to retreat, and she couldn't afford weakness. "Victoria," she said calmly, meeting her sister's gaze, which she held for only a second before turning back to the audience. "I just wanted to say," Victoria continued, now addressing the guests rather than her sister herself, "that despite all the difficulties, despite the distance that sometimes separates us, real family ties remain inseparable." At that moment, someone clapped a little louder, and the audience took up the applause as if on cue. "Come on, Mom, bow down like in a theater," Noah whispered, smiling, taking everything that was happening for a game, not realizing the background of the situation. Eleanor smiled at him, stroked her hair, and without saying a word, sat down again, making it clear that the performance was over for her. Victoria, satisfied with the effect she had produced, nodded slightly and, turning around, majestically retreated back to the stage, leaving her sister under the gazes of dozens of guests who were now studying her with undisguised curiosity. "Mom, that was weird," Noah remarked softly, sitting back down in his seat and reaching for a glass of water. "Yes, son, it was strange," Eleanor agreed, regaining her composure. At that moment, a waiter approached their table, politely leaning over and handing her a note on a small tray. "From Ms. Griffin," he explained briefly, nodding toward the main table where their mother was sitting. Eleanor unfolded the paper and immediately recognized her mother's strict handwriting. "I'm waiting for you in the winter garden. It's urgent." She took a deep breath, trying to suppress her excitement, and slowly stood up. "You're going to stay here, Noah, okay?" she said to her son, who nodded, although there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. The winter garden was located on the hotel's terrace, where through the glass walls you could admire the snow-covered streets of the city, shining in the evening light. Eleanor stepped in, feeling the frosty air burn her skin slightly. But what struck her most was Martha herself, sitting alone at a small table with a glass of champagne in her hand. "You came," she said without looking up. "You called me," Eleanor replied, sitting down opposite her. The mother was silent for a long time, just running her finger along the edge of the glass before finally speaking. "Why did you come?" Eleanor narrowed her eyes in surprise. Because you invited me, she said softly, not understanding where this conversation was going. No, Martha shook her head. Victoria invited you. Eleanor tensed but answered calmly. So what? Martha finally looked up at her, cold, impassive, the way he had always been. You shouldn't have come, she said slowly, choosing each word carefully. This wedding is not the place for you. The words hit like a slap in the face, and Eleanor was momentarily speechless. No place for me? What is it? She asked, her voice tinged with steel. Don't you understand? Martha sighed wearily. You're different. You've never belonged in this world, Eleanor. You're a mistake, the wrong link in our family, and if your father were alive, he would understand that. Eleanor froze. Would he understand? What is it? She asked in a whisper. You mean he didn't love me? Martha didn't answer, but her silence said more than any words could. Something inside Eleanor collapsed. She could feel anger rising in her chest, but she couldn't let it get the better of her. She clenched her teeth, stood up, looked coldly at her mother, and said only one thing. You have no right to speak for him. Turning around, she quickly walked out of the conservatory without turning around. When she returned to the gym, Noah was waiting for her with a worried expression on his face. Mom, are you okay? Eleanor looked at her son, and despite the fact that everything inside her was trembling, she smiled. Of course, dear. We won't be here long. And at that moment, she already knew that they wouldn't stay here a second longer than necessary. Eleanor felt a throbbing pain mixed with anger in her chest, but most of all, there was a lack of understanding. What exactly this man was going to say, why he was talking about the will of her father, who had been gone for several years, and why he chose this moment to break the silence that had shrouded the name of William Griffin since that very night. When did he pass away? The whole room froze, tension hovering in the air, like a taut string that is ready to snap from one wrong move. Victoria, who seemed confident a second ago, now turned pale, and her impeccable posture suddenly lost its former pride. Martha, on the other hand, maintained her outward composure, but her thin fingers convulsively clutched a napkin lying on the table. What do you mean? Victoria's voice trailed off, but she quickly regained her composure and added, with a tight smile, Is this the right time to make such statements, Mr. Morrison? We are all here to celebrate our wedding, not to discuss the past. James tilted his head slightly, as if agreeing with her, but there was something in his gaze that sent a chill down Eleanor's skin. That's right, Miss Victoria. His voice was flat, but there was a hint of steel in it. But the past has a way of reminding you of itself at the most unexpected moments, especially when it comes to your father's legacy. The words legacy and father rang out loud like a thunderclap in this gilded hall. The guests whispered, someone exchanged glances, and the groom, Richard, who was standing next to the bride, frowned and glared at James. What are you trying to say? Victoria's voice sounded harsh now, like a taut string at the end of her patience. It's just that your father had a clear desire for who should own everything he left behind. James paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. And according to his will, which, by the way, has remained hidden until today, all his property, including this hotel, company, and assets, do not belong to you, Miss Victoria, and not to you, Ms. Marta. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. The hum of voices at the tables grew louder. Someone gasped. Someone laughed incredulously, and Victoria, whose hands were white with tension, clutching the hem of her dress, slowly exhaled. This lie. It's true. James took a folded piece of paper, sealed with an official seal from the inside pocket of his jacket. And if in doubt, I'll be happy to provide you with a copy of the document. Martha, who had remained silent until then, abruptly rose from her seat. Her voice was cold, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. This will has been changed. It's never changed, James said calmly. Your husband signed it a few weeks before his death and instructed me to make sure that his last wishes would be fulfilled. And who will inherit, in your opinion? Victoria laughed, a short, harsh, panicked laugh. James slowly turned to Eleanor. Your father was ashamed of the way you were treated, he said confidently, but there was a note of sincere regret in his voice. He wanted to correct a mistake he made many years ago, and therefore everything that belonged to him now rightfully belongs to you, Mistress Eleanor. Silence reigned in the hall, so dense that it seemed as if the air had thickened and become viscous, preventing anyone from moving. Victoria's eyes widened, Martha paled, and Richard shook his head with a strange grin. "It's impossible," Martha finally gasped. "You're lying." James shrugged his shoulders. "The documents are at the notary, Ms. Griffin. You can check them at any time." Eleanor felt her insides turning over. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her father? Did you take care of her? Did you want her to not be the exile she was made into? And now, after all these years, after all the humiliation, this room belonged to her? Noah tugged on her arm. "Mom, is that true?" She looked into his eyes, full of childish curiosity and hope, and suddenly realized that it was really true. She is no longer that poor relative who has to endure humiliation. She is no longer someone who can be kicked out of this society, not someone who they dare to buy at auction. She stood up slowly. "I think it's time for us to leave," she said. But this time, her voice sounded different. Victoria took a step towards her, clenching her fists. "You're not going anywhere." Eleanor looked at her. "You're wrong. Now I can go wherever I want." She took Noah's hand, nodded her thanks to James, and headed for the exit. People made way for her. Some looked at her with curiosity, some with envy, some with respect. Victoria and Marta remained standing in the middle of the hall, unable to move. When Eleanor went outside, the frosty air touched her face. She took a deep breath, feeling the freshness rush into her lungs. "Mom, are we going to live in the castle now?" Noah whispered. She laughed. "No, son, but now we have the opportunity to live the way we want." And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt that her fate was no longer in someone else's hands. "Have you done anything wrong?" James's voice was not loud, but there was such an inflexibility in it that even the boldest whispers in the audience instantly subsided, giving way to tense silence. "Then let me explain exactly what was done according to these documents." He unfolded another piece of paper, carefully running his finger over it, as if emphasizing each point. Over the past 3 years, transfers have been made from various Griffin Enterprise accounts to the personal accounts of Martha Griffin and Victoria Griffin. These amounts, according to the submitted accounting reports, were listed as corporate expenses. But as you can see, he pointed to the screen where the numbers flashed, many of them went to pay for luxury goods, real estate abroad, private flights, and other expenses that have nothing to do with business. Victoria gripped the edge of the table, her face contorted into a mask of horror. It's impossible." Her voice was trembling, but she was still trying to hold on. "This is a mistake. Is this a fake? Is it a mistake?" James raised an eyebrow, but his tone remained steady, confident, like a granite wall against which it was useless to beat. "Then perhaps you can explain why the accounts to which these amounts were transferred are registered in your name. Why was one of these transfers made only 2 weeks ago, despite the fact that, according to your own statement, the company has already completely passed into your hands?" Martha clenched her teeth, her fingers clutching the arms of the chair convulsively. "This is our business," she hissed, forgetting about her outward composure. "We have the right to dispose of funds as we see fit." "Of course," James agreed calmly, "but only if these funds really belong to you. However, as the will shows, the main owner of the company is now Miss Eleanor Griffin. This means that any misappropriation of assets is subject to criminal liability." The hum in the hall was growing. The guests were talking excitedly. Someone was stealthily filming what was happening on the phone, and someone was just shaking his head in shock, unable to believe such a rapid turn of events. Richard, who had been in the shadows, suddenly stood up abruptly, pulling his hand out of his father's grip. "Victoria," his voice was low, but there was a sharp, icy note in it. "Is that true?" "What do you mean?" Victoria turned to him, her lips trembling. "I'm asking," he stepped closer. Now his eyes were fixed on her face with a kind of frightening expression. "Did you really steal money? You and your mother?" "Richard, that's not true," she hissed, trying to maintain her dignity. "It's a trap. They're trying to frame us." "Answer me directly." His voice became tougher, and now there was clearly disbelief in it. "Did you lie to me?" Victoria recoiled, but when she met his gaze, she froze, unable to find words. "You," his lips curled into a bitter smile. "Oh my God, I thought I knew you. I thought I was going to marry an honest, decent woman." "Richard." But he wasn't listening anymore. Slowly, almost with painful realization, he tore the wedding ring from her finger and dropped it on the table between them. "This wedding is over," he said calmly, turning to the stunned guests. Like a bolt from the blue, these words hung in the air, causing everyone to freeze in complete silence. Victoria, realizing what was happening, jerked her head up, her eyes flashing lightning. "You're going to regret this." "Stop it," she hissed, but Richard was already ignoring her. At that moment, the judge, who had previously been introduced by James, got up from his seat and slowly walked towards the stage. "I think we should immediately review all the evidence presented," he said, his voice resonant and authoritative. "Due to the seriousness of the allegations, I recommend that all accounts related to Mrs. Martha Griffin and Miss Victoria Griffin be frozen pending a full investigation." "No!" Martha jumped up, her face flushed with rage. "You have no right." "I have every right, Ms. Griffin." The judge looked at her coldly. "Moreover, both of you are subject to immediate interrogation as part of the investigation into financial fraud." Victoria and Marta froze like cornered predators, realizing that their world was crumbling before their eyes. I stood clutching Noah's hand, feeling the chaos unfold around me, but inside I was strangely calm. It was as if the long years of pain, humiliation, loneliness, and hopelessness had suddenly melted away, giving way to a new feeling, a sense of justice, a sense that now I was no longer just a victim. I slowly raised my head and looked at James. "What now?" He smiled, faintly, with respect. "Now, Miss Griffin, you have the opportunity to start over. On your terms." I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the surging emotions, and squeezed Noah's hand tighter, feeling his small fingers tremble in my palm. He looked at me with childlike trustfulness, with that naive faith that made me hold on, did not allow me to break down even in the most difficult moments. The audience was still in the grip of shock, but not the one that was accompanied by ridicule and contempt, but a new, deafening realization of the truth. The guests, who had recently laughed at the humiliation, were now whispering to each other, glancing first at me, then at James, then at Victoria and Martha, whose faces had turned gray with rage and impotence. Victoria whispered hoarsely, clenching her fists so that her knuckles turned white. "This is some kind of fraud." "Oh, Miss Victoria." James looked at her gently, almost sympathetically, but there was no doubt in his voice. "The only scammers in this room are you and your mother. We will not give up everything just like that." Martha, having lost all composure, abruptly stepped forward as if intending to snatch the will from James's hands. But he only turned slightly, and the judge, who had been calmly watching what was happening, raised his hand. "If you don't want to make things worse, I suggest you keep your dignity, Mrs. Griffin," he said coldly. "All assets that were illegally appropriated by you and your daughter will be frozen and returned to their rightful owner." "You can't prove anything," Martha squealed, her lips trembling. "You still don't understand, do you?" James sighed, shaking his head. "We don't need to prove anything. Everything has already been proven. Bank transfers, fictitious transactions, financial fraud, all this is recorded and referred to the appropriate authorities." "This is the end, Mom," Victoria suddenly said. There was no previous arrogance in her voice, only emptiness. Marta turned to her, staring angrily. "How can you say that?" "Because I don't want to go to prison," Victoria replied coldly and pressed her lips together. There was silence in the hall. Martha staggered as if she'd been hit. "Prison?" "Yes, it's a prison," James said calmly. "Depending on the cooperation and admission of guilt, the court will determine what kind of punishment you are entitled to." I was silent, but a strange feeling gradually spread in my chest, Not revenge, not gloating, but liberation. These women who had controlled my life for so long, destroyed it, humiliated me and my son, were now facing the consequences of their actions. I didn't mean them any harm. I just didn't want to be afraid of them anymore. Richard had been standing motionless the entire time, his face expressionless, but there was disappointment in his eyes. He gave Victoria a look full of bitterness, then turned and left without saying a word. His parents followed him, leaving their daughter-in-law and her mother alone. I took a deep breath, feeling like the world I've been living in for the last few years is crumbling, leaving something new and unexplored in front of me. "James," I said softly, turning to him, "and now what?" "Now," he smiled a light, encouraging smile, "you have to take over the management of the company. It won't be easy, but you have everything you need." I nodded. "You can handle it, Mom," Noah suddenly said, squeezing my hand. I looked at him, and the words were so simple, but they had everything I needed to hear. I smiled, squeezing his hand back. "Yes, my dear, I can handle it." I looked at the pile of documents neatly laid out on the table in James's office and felt a strange, almost surreal realization spreading inside me that everything I had been detached from for so long now belonged to me. Griffin Real Estate, the company founded by my father, his pride, his brainchild, his legacy, was now in my hands. My thoughts were confused, my heart was pounding, and somewhere in the back of my mind, fear arose. Not fear of difficulties, but fear of responsibility, of whether I could meet my father's expectations, whether I could lead the company forward the way he wanted. James, watching me, must have understood what I was thinking, because his voice was soft but confident. "Eleanor, don't be afraid. I know it sounds scary, but you're not alone. The company has professionals who have worked with your father for years, people who are dedicated to the cause, who want to see Griffin Real Estate flourish. And most importantly, you have an instinct, an understanding of people, and you've never made easy decisions because you've always thought about the consequences. That's what makes you a strong leader." I looked up at him, trying to catch a glimmer of doubt in his gaze, but I found nothing but firm confidence. I remembered how my father taught me to analyze people, how he said that in business, it's not enough just to know numbers well. You need to see through people, understand their motives, their fears, and desires. "I have no right to make mistakes," I said softly. "You have the right to make mistakes," James said, "but you don't have the right to give up." I nodded. Yes, he's right. I'm no longer the girl who was once disinherited, kicked out of the house, and forced to start life from scratch. I've been through too much to let fear rule me now. The secretary cautiously looked into the office. "Miss Griffin, you have a meeting with the executive board in 20 minutes. I took a deep breath. This will be the first meeting where I will officially announce myself as the new owner of the company. Thanks, I'll be ready. When the door closed behind the secretary, James smiled. "You can handle it." I wanted to answer, but at that moment, the door opened again, and Noah came in. He rushed to me, hugged me around the waist, and looked up at me with his big brown eyes. "Mom, are you going to be in charge now?" I ran my hand through his blonde hair, smiled, and nodded. "Yes, baby, I'm in charge now." He looked at me seriously, as if weighing my words, then suddenly smiled and said with a confidence that I myself did not yet possess, "Then everything will be fine." I laughed, but my laughter was full of emotion, and somewhere deep in my soul I realized that these simple words of my son would become for me the very beacon that would not allow me to lose my way. Half an hour later, I was standing in the conference room in front of members of the board of directors, people who had worked side by side with my father for years, who had seen the ups and downs of the company, who now looked at me with different emotions: curiosity, doubt, and some even with hope. I glanced at James, who was invisibly supporting me, then turned my gaze to the audience and said in a firm voice, "Good morning. My name is Eleanor Griffin, and from now on, I will run this company." There was a short pause, but no one objected, no one grinned, no one doubted my words. I continued, feeling my confidence grow with each word. Griffin Real Estate has always been more than just a business. This is my father's legacy, his dream, and his work. I know that times are difficult now, that the company has gone through upheavals and trials, but I am sure that we can overcome everything if we work together. I'm not going to change everything right now. I'm not going to act hastily. But one thing is for sure, we are moving forward. I fell silent, peering into the faces of the crowd. And then something happened that I didn't expect. People at the table started nodding. Someone even smiled. And I realized that the first step had been taken. When the meeting ended and I left the conference room, I was suddenly overcome with fatigue. But there was something sweet about that fatigue, a sense of satisfaction. James was waiting for me at the door. How did it go? I smiled. Better than I expected. I told you, he winked. I grinned and suddenly felt my heart fill with warmth. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I should be. The room was dim, sticky, filled with the smell of long, stale coffee and a slight musty smell that appears in places where windows have not been opened for too long. Martha slowly ran her hand along the windowsill, feeling the rough surface under her fingers, which was no longer hidden by expensive furniture or the finest silk curtains. This was her new existence, small, cramped, faceless, imbued with a sense of lost possibilities and an irrevocably departed past. There was a thud behind her as Victoria threw an old newspaper, obviously reread many times, onto the table and said irritably, "They're writing about her again, about this Saint Eleanor, about her charitable foundation, about the new era of Griffin Real Estate." Martha turned slowly, her gaze, once full of arrogant superiority, now heavy, tired, and almost extinguished. "And what do you suggest?" "What is it?" she asked coldly. Victoria clenched her teeth, clenched her fists, and suddenly hit the table with all her might. "She stole everything from us. Everything that was supposed to be ours. We were supposed to live in luxury, not vegetate in this miserable bedbug." Martha grinned, but there was no joy in the sound, only bitterness. "She didn't steal anything from us, Victoria. We tried to steal it from her, and in the end, we were left with nothing." My sister flushed and wanted to object, but when she met her mother's icy gaze, she abruptly fell silent. There was a long, lingering silence, filled only with the muffled sound of rain outside the window. And in the center of Boston, in a spacious, bright office located on the top floor of the Griffin Real Estate building, Eleanor was at that moment looking through another project, drawings of a new residential complex, which was supposed to be the first milestone in her big plan to create affordable, eco-friendly housing. "This is a bold move," James said thoughtfully, sitting across from him and carefully studying the documents. "Many companies would prefer not to get involved with such a complex project. There are too many risks." Eleanor looked up from the drawings and looked at him. "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" He chuckled and shook his head. "No, I think you're the only person who can do that." She smiled, but deep down she knew that this was just the beginning. There was still a lot of work ahead, many decisions to be made, and not all of them would be easy. "I'm meeting with investors tomorrow," she said, diving back into the project. "They want to hear my arguments." "Are you sure they will support this project?" Eleanor looked at him, and the familiar steel fire flashed in her eyes. "They will support you, because I won't give them any reason to doubt." That evening, when she returned home, she was greeted by Noah's joyful laughter. He was playing with James, running around the living room with a toy airplane in his hands. "Mom, James showed me how to make paper airplanes properly. Look!" He launched the plane, and it flew smoothly across the room, landing gently on the sofa. Eleanor laughed, went up to her son, and hugged him. "Good job, kid." Noah suddenly looked up at her seriously. "Mom, would Grandpa be proud of me?" She felt her throat tighten, but she smiled, patted her son on the head, and replied, "Grandpa would be more proud of you than you can imagine." Noah nodded thoughtfully and then started playing again. Eleanor turned to James, who was watching them with a soft smile. "Thank you for spending so much time with him," she said softly. "It's not a burden," he replied. "I'm glad to be around." She nodded, but something in his tone made her look at him for a long time. At that moment, she realized that in all these months, James had become for her not just a friend, not just an advisor or a person to whom her father had once entrusted their fate. He became a part of her life, a part of her family. Her heart clenched in a strange new sensation. Perhaps she had yet to figure out what that meant. The city outside the window was bathed in the soft silver glow of falling snow, each snowflake swirling in the light of the streetlights, reminding me of the time that was inexorably moving forward, taking with it past grievances, mistakes, and disappointments, leaving room only for a new beginning, for the light that comes after the darkest night. There was a festive atmosphere in the house, quiet laughter, the muffled clink of glasses, the smell of pine needles and fresh pastries, and in the very center of this warm, cozy picture stood Noah, holding in his hands an old photograph of his grandfather, from which the wise and kind eyes of William Griffin looked at him. I looked at my son, feeling my heart contract with warmth and a slight sadness at the same time, because he never knew his grandfather, did not hear his voice, did not feel his strong, reliable embrace, but still felt his presence in our lives, as if William was always somewhere nearby, invisibly watching over by us, guided and protected. "Mom," Noah said suddenly without taking his eyes off the photo, "I've never met my grandfather, but he must have been a good man." I smiled, gently tucking an unruly lock of his hair behind his ear, and knelt down and hugged him. "Yes, baby, he was the best person I knew, and even now he's watching us, proud of you, happy that you're growing up to be such a kind and smart boy." Noah nodded thoughtfully, clutching the photo to his chest, and then suddenly smiled broadly, as if at that moment he realized something important to himself, something that would forever remain in his heart. Behind us, the soft hum of voices mingled with the crackling of wood in the fireplace, creating a sense of comfort and tranquility that I had missed so much before. Martha was sitting next to him. Her face, which had once expressed cold arrogance, now became softer, the wrinkles on her forehead smoothed out, and in her eyes there was a new, barely perceptible tenderness that had previously seemed impossible for her. Victoria was talking quietly with one of the company's employees. Her voice sounded calm, without the previous nervousness and desire to prove something to the whole world. "Thank you for inviting us, Eleanor," Martha said suddenly, meeting my gaze. I don't even know how to express how I feel." I nodded, realizing that these words were not easy for her. "Just be here, Mom," I replied. And for the first time in a long time, this address didn't seem alien to me, filled with pain and bitterness. I looked towards James, who was watching me with a smile, holding a glass of wine in his hands. There was something special in his gaze, not just admiration or friendly support, but something deeper, real, something that I might not have noticed before or didn't want to realize. "To a wonderful future," he said, raising his glass. I nodded slightly, accepting his toast, but inside I felt something was changing in my soul, something important and inevitable, as if life itself was telling me that it was time to leave the past behind and take a step towards a new one. The snow outside the window continued to fall, covering the city with a soft white blanket, and at that moment I realized that despite all the difficulties, losses, and trials, life always gives you a chance to start anew, if you have the courage to accept this chance and take the first step.